A man crawls through snow that comes up to his chest. His face is bleeding where the ice has cut it. His lungs feel as though they are full of broken glass. And he is certain, absolutely certain, that he is about to dig two frozen bodies out of a hole in the side of a mountain. A young widow. A small boy. He had warned her. The whole town had warned her. Sell the land. Come down before the cold. And she had refused. She had done something far worse than refuse. She had picked up a shovel and started digging. Now the cruelest storm in living memory is screaming down off the peaks. And he is climbing through it on his hands and knees to find what is left of her. He does not yet know that he is wrong. He does not yet know that beneath 60 feet of solid granite, a fire is quietly burning, and it will not go out. The aspens were just beginning to bud the morning they put her husband in the ground. A young widow stood at the edge of the grave, her black dress too thin for the wind that came down off the high peaks. She did not feel the cold. She did not feel much of anything at all. The wind moved through the pale trees. It carried away the words of the man speaking over the open earth, and she let it. Beside her stood a small boy, 6 years old. He held his father's leather sketchbook against his chest with both hands, the way another child might hold a toy or a worn blanket. He had not let go of it since the men carried his father home. He slept with it now, ate beside it, held it through the long nights when the cabin creaked and the dark pressed against the one good window. The widow's name was Marin Hale. And on that cold morning, she became the thing the whole town had been quietly waiting for her to become. A problem to be solved. Her husband had been a young man, a geologist. He had walked these mountains with a notebook in one hand and a small hammer in the other, and he had loved the stone the way other men loved horses, or whiskey, or gold. He had loved her more. A slide of rock had taken him. The men said it was quick. She did not believe them. She had decided, somewhere deep down where no one could argue with her, that nothing about death was ever quick. Death was a slow thing. It kept happening. Every morning, when she woke and reached across the bed and found only cold sheets where the warmth of him used to be, it happened again. The townspeople stood at a careful distance from the grave. Their faces were arranged into the proper shapes: sympathy, sorrow, the soft, practiced grief of people who would go home that night to warm suppers and living husbands. Marin looked past every one of them, and there, at the back, she saw him, the tallest man in the crowd, the widest. He stood the way a man stands when he owns the mill that cut the lumber for half the houses in the valley, when he has built things and knows the worth of things, and has stopped, long ago, asking anyone's permission. His hat was in his hands, but his eyes were not on the grave. His eyes were up the slope, fixed on her crooked little cabin, just visible through the budding trees. He was looking at it the way a carpenter looks at a chair that is about to break, measuring it, already deciding what would have to be done with it. His name was Harlan Crane. And in that moment, standing over the body of the only man who had ever truly known her, Marin understood exactly what was coming. She had thought it would come as cruelty. She would learn soon enough that it would come as something far heavier than cruelty. It would come as kindness. The first basket arrived 3 days later. A woman from the dry goods store left it on the threshold. Bread, A jar of preserves. A small wedge of cheese wrapped in clean cloth. Just thinking of you, dear, the woman said. She would not come inside. She handed the basket across the doorway and looked past Marin's shoulder into the dim cabin. And her face did something strange. It was the look people give at a funeral home, when they stand over a body and try to find something to say. Sad, distant, already gone. The second basket came the next day. The third, the day after that. By the time the snow had melted from the lower slopes, the widow had more dry bread than two people could ever eat. She fed some of it to the squirrels. She cried one evening over a jar of dark berry jam left by a woman whose name she could not even remember. Pity was supposed to be a kindness. It did not feel like a kindness. It felt like a stone, settling into her chest, a little heavier with each soft voice that said, "Bless your heart," and would not meet her eyes. And slowly she began to understand. They were not bringing her food. They were saying goodbye. In their minds, the matter was already settled. The widow had already failed, already packed, already disappeared down the mountain into a life of rough red hands and other women's leftovers, with a fatherless boy raised on charity. She was a story the town had finished telling. Marin smiled at each of them. She thanked them. She closed the door, and she felt herself dying, one basket at a time. Summer came up the valley slow and green. The boy began to speak again, only a little, in short, careful sentences, as if he were learning the words back one at a time. He drew on flat stones with the worn-down nubs of his father's charcoal. He drew the same thing over and over. A man, a hammer, a mountain, and the widow did the work that grief always leaves behind. She tended the small garden. She mended the same dress 3 times over. She read at night by a single oil lamp. Books her husband had collected, full of words about rock and earth she only half understood. But she did not open his journals. She could not. To open them would be to hear his voice again. And she did not believe, not yet, that she could survive hearing his voice. So they sat in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, untouched, like a small grave, kept inside the house. The days stretched long and warm, and for a while the mountain was kind. The garden gave her beans and a few thin carrots. The boy hummed sometimes, almost without knowing it, while he sorted his colored stones on the porch, and Marin let herself believe, for a few weeks, that the worst was behind her. That grief had a bottom, and she had finally touched it, and the only direction left was up. She was wrong. Late in the warm season, something changed in the woods. The squirrels went strange first. She noticed it by the woodpile. They were frantic, tearing at pine cones, burying nuts in places they would never find them again. Their small cheeks stuffed full, their eyes wild with a kind of fear that had no name. An old trapper came up the mountain to sell her some dried meat. He stood at her gate and looked up at the tops of the highest trees. "Aspens are turning," he said, "a full month early." She looked. He was right. The very crowns of the tallest trees, the ones that caught the most wind, had already begun to go gold. "Does it mean something?" she asked. The old man chewed slowly. He spat. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who is about to hear bad news. "Means a hard one's coming, ma'am." He let that sit a moment. "Folks haven't seen a sign like this in longer than I've been alive. Last time the old-timers talked about A winter like that emptied half this gulch. Took more than 30 souls. I was just a boy, but I remember. Marin put her hand on the gatepost. The wood was warm from the sun. How hard, she said. But the old man did not answer right away. He looked at the cabin. He looked at her thin shoulders, at the crooked little chimney, at the weak gray smoke that rose from it. "Ma'am," he said at last, "if I were you, I'd think about going down to the boarding house. And I'd think about it real soon." He tipped his hat, and he walked away. She stood at the gate a long time after he was gone. The wind, even in the warm season, had an edge to it now. A small, serrated promise. She felt it on her cheek, like a knife held very gently against the skin. That night, she stood in the doorway and watched her son sleep, and she did the arithmetic that every widow learns to do in the dark. How much wood she could split alone. How thin the cabin walls had grown. How many miles to the nearest help, and how deep the snow would lie across them. The numbers did not add up to survival. She knew that. And still, something in her refused to walk down that mountain with her hat in her hands. She did not yet know what that something was. She only knew it was there, and that it was stubborn. He came on a Tuesday. She had been expecting him. Some part of her had been expecting him since the morning at the grave. Harlan Crane did not knock. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, hat in hand, and waited for her to open the door. As if knocking would have been a familiarity he did not care to claim. "Mrs. Hale?" "Mr. Crane." She did not invite him in. He did not seem to expect it. He came up the 3 steps slowly, and she watched him do the thing he could not help doing. She watched him feel the give in the second board, the soft, rotten sponginess of the third. His eyes traveled up to the sagging roofline, to the gap where the door frame had pulled away from the log wall. He saw her home the way a doctor sees a dying patient. She knew every word he was going to say before he opened his mouth. "I'll speak plain, Mrs. Hale." He cleared his throat. "This cabin will not survive the first hard freeze, let alone the deep of winter. The logs are green. The chinking has gone to dust. That roof has a sag in it. And when the snow piles on, it's going to come down on you and the boy, both." "I know," she said. It threw him off his stride. He had come prepared to argue. "You know." "I know what the cabin is, Mr. Crane." He turned his hat in his big hands. "Then you know what has to happen. The mining concern will pay you fair for the timber rights. Enough for a full year at the boarding house in town. The laundry's hiring. They've lost 2 girls to marriage this season. And there's a schoolhouse for the boy." He said all of it the way a man reads a list off a hardware shelf. Practical, reasonable, final. Marin looked at him for a long moment. "I have already buried a husband, Mr. Crane." He blinked. "Pardon?" "I said I have already buried a husband." Her voice did not shake. "I am not going to bury his land as well. Not yet." And then he looked at her, truly looked, perhaps for the very first time, and she watched his face do the small, embarrassed thing she had seen on so many faces these past months, the flicker of a man realizing she was a person, and then forgetting it again, because remembering was inconvenient. "Mrs. Hale, with respect, sentiment is not shelter." "No," she said, "but neither is a laundry." A silence stretched between them, thin and cold. "I'll think on it, Mr. Crane. Thank you for climbing all the way up." He waited, as if her surrender might still arrive. Late, right there on the porch. It did not. He put his hat back on. He went down the steps. More carefully on the second board this time. At the gate, he stopped. He did not turn around. "Winter is not a thing you can negotiate with, Mrs. Hale. I have seen what it does to a cabin like this one." A pause. "I have helped carry the bodies out. Do not make me carry yours." And then he was gone, down the slope, between the half-gold trees. She stood on the porch until she could no longer see him. Her hands were shaking. She did not yet know whether it was fear or fury. That night, she would learn it was both. She wept for 2 days. She was not proud of it, but she did. 2 days of grief and terror, and the slow, suffocating weight of every basket that had ever been carried up that mountain. The boy grew quiet again. He stopped drawing. He sat on the floor beside her chair and rested his small hand on her knee, and said nothing. Because there was nothing a child of 6 could say. And on the second night, in the worst of it, she very nearly broke. She took out the carpet bag from under the bed. She set it on the table. She began with shaking hands to fold the boy's 2 good shirts. She told herself it was sense. She told herself Crane was right, that the old trapper was right, that a mother who walked her son into a killing winter to spite a town was no kind of mother at all. She folded the shirts. She set them in the bag, and then she looked at the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and she could not finish. On the 3rd day, the weeping stopped. It was not a decision. It was more like a well running dry. She had used up every tear in her body, and there were simply none left. What remained was clear, and cold, and hard. She would not become a ward of this town. She would not raise her son in the steam and the lie of another woman's laundry. She would not sell the land her husband had loved. She would not be the story the town had already finished telling. She did not yet know what she would do. She only knew what she would not. That night, she put the boy to bed under 3 blankets. She lit the oil lamp. She took the folded shirts out of the carpet bag and put them away. And then she walked to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and she opened it. His handwriting struck her like an open hand, the slant of it, the careful little hooks on his letters. She had to lay her palm flat against the page and simply breathe for a moment before she could read it all. And then she read. The first journals were full of his work. Surveys, sample notes, the dry, precise language of a man bent over stone. She understood barely half of it, and yet, reading it, she could hear him, the rhythm of him, the patient care in every line. She read for an hour, and she did not cry. That was a kind of victory. But the 4th journal was different, smaller, older. The leather cracked when she opened it, and the script inside was not her husband's hand at all. It was a copied hand. He had been transcribing something, translating it. The original words, she slowly realized, were in Old German, and he had written the English carefully in the margins beside them. On the inside cover, in his own neat printing, were the words, "From the journal of my great-grandmother, Brigida Maurer, stonemason's wife." Marin turned the page, and the language changed. It was no longer the language of survey lines and sample weights. It was the language of stone, but stone as something living, something that breathed slowly in the dark. She leaned closer to the lamp. The young men build walls against the winter, her husband had translated in that careful slanted hand. They cut the trees, they saw the boards, they build a thin box and stuff it with rags, and they fight the wind with thin wood and angry fires. She read on, barely breathing. But the old ones, who have buried their fathers, know better. The wise one does not fight the mountain. The wise one invites the mountain into the home. She read that line 3 times. Then she kept going. The old woman had written of great stoves built of brick and clay and tile, stoves the size of small rooms. You burned one small hot fire in them once a day, and the smoke did not rush straight up and out. It twisted slowly through the body of the stove, through long winding passages of stone, giving up every bit of its heat as it went, until it crawled out the chimney barely warm. The stone drank the heat in, it held it, and it gave it back, slow and steady, through a whole day and a whole night. She wrote of homes dug into hillsides, of stables carved into the living rock, of a cousin who could winter in the high country with a goat and a child on almost no wood at all, and come out fat and laughing in the spring. And then there was a line that Maren would never forget. The earth is not dead, my child. The earth is a slow, warm animal, and her heart is a furnace. Lay your home against her ribs, and she will keep you. Maren read until the lamp guttered low, and then she sat in the dark a long while after. She thought about her husband, bent over an old German journal late at night, in the long, quiet evenings when she had believed he was working on his dull survey notes. He had never spoken of this, not once. He had never said, "My great-grandmother knew how to live inside a mountain." He had simply translated it, quietly, in secret, as if he were saving something. She did not know why. Maybe he had not fully known himself. Maybe a part of him had felt the cold coming, long before any of them. But it was here now. It was here, in her hands. The next morning she went back to the chest, and she picked up the last journal, the newest one, the leather barely worn. She opened it, and a single folded sheet of paper slipped out and drifted to the floor. It was a map, drawn in her husband's hand. Their plot of land, the cabin, the creek, the stand of aspen, and there, on the far side of the property, marked with a small, careful X, beside the X, in his neat printing, a handful of words. Most she did not understand, but one she did. Warm! Investigate further. And then she remembered now, he had spoken of it, once. A month before he died, he had come in flushed and excited, washed his hands, and said something about that old hole he dug the summer before. The failed one. The one the men in town laughed at and called his folly. The strangest thing, he had said. I went back to it today. The rock at the very back is warm, truly warm, deep underground. It makes no sense. And she had been counting jars, canning beans. She had nodded and said something like, "That's nice, dear." And he had laughed and kissed the top of her head and gone out to chop wood. She had not thought of it once since, until now. Maren sat very still on the floor of her cabin. The room was lit only by the gray light of dawn, coming through the one good window her husband had set with such care. In her hand was a map, and in her chest, where the cold stone of pity had been sitting for so many long months, something else had taken its place, Something small and burning, the shape of a question. What if? She did not sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of not sleeping. She lay awake beside her son, listening to him breathe, and she thought about a hole in the side of a mountain, about rock that was warm in the dead of the cold, about a long-dead woman who had buried her own father and learned somehow to invite the mountain into her home. At the first gray light, she rose. She dressed. She left a note for the boy on the table. She took a lantern and matches and the map, and she walked the half-mile to the back of the plot in a kind of fever. The grass was stiff with frost. Her breath came out in clouds. She found it exactly where the map said it would be. She had walked past this place 100 times and never once truly looked at it. The mouth of the tunnel was choked with fallen rock and dead brush, dry, thorny vines grown thick across the opening. She set down the lantern, and she began to pull. Her hands were not made for this. They were a seamstress's hands. Within minutes, they were bleeding. She did not stop. She tore at the brush. She rolled the stones aside. She cleared a hole just large enough for a woman to crawl through. She lit the lantern. She got down on her hands and knees, and she crawled inside the mountain. The first thing was the silence. The wind, which had been blowing steady all morning, simply vanished. She had not known how loud the world above was until she dropped below it. The silence in here had a shape. It pressed gently against her ears. The second thing was the air. It was cold, but not the cold of the morning outside. A different cold, still old. The cold of a deep cellar, not the cold of a knife-edged wind. She crawled deeper. The lantern light caught the quartz in the walls and made it glitter like a scatter of small stars. The tunnel narrowed. She could touch both walls with her elbows. And then she stopped. She lifted her hand to her cheek. Her cheek was cold, but the air against it was not cold. It was not warm, either. It was simply still. The air of an indoor room, deep in the bones of a mountain. She kept crawling. 40 feet, 50, and at the very end, a solid wall of granite. Marin sat back on her heels. She lifted the lantern. Quartz veins ran through the stone like pale rivers of milk. Beautiful. Useless, her husband had written. Barren. She put her palm flat against the rock, and she gasped. It was warm. Not warm like a stove is warm. Not warm like a stone left out in the sun. It was warm the way a sleeping animal is warm. Living. Patient. A heat that had been there 1,000 years before her hand ever touched it, and would be there 1,000 years after. She kept her hand pressed to the stone, and she closed her eyes, and she thought of the old woman in the journal, and of her husband, bent over a lamp, translating a dead woman's words by candlelight, year after quiet year. The wise one invites the mountain into the home. She opened her eyes, and she crawled back out into the blinding morning. She came up onto the frozen grass covered in mud and rock dust, her hands raw and bleeding, her dress ruined, and the cold stone of pity in her chest was gone. In its place was something terrifying and something wonderful. A plan. She told the boy at breakfast. She had lain awake half the night wondering how to say it to a child of 6. In the end, she simply said it plain. Asa, I want to tell you something. He looked up from his bowl. "We are going to live in the mountain." He chewed. He swallowed. He thought about it with the whole serious weight of his small face. "Like a bear," he said, and something in her chest cracked open, warm. "A little like a bear." "Yes." He thought a moment longer. "Will Papa's pictures come too?" "Yes," she said softly. "Papa's pictures come too." "All right," said the boy, and he went back to his breakfast. Maren turned quickly to the stove so he would not see her face. 6 years old. All right. As if she had told him only that they were having soup for supper. He had more faith in her than she had in herself, and she decided, right then, standing at the stove with her ruined hands, that she would simply have to grow into it. She knew almost nothing about what lay ahead. She did not know how to fire a single brick, or raise a wall of stone, or turn a dead hole in a hillside into a home that could hold a child against the deep of winter. She had a shovel, a pickaxe, a lantern, a map, and a journal written by a woman who had been dead for the better part of a century. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But the gold was already climbing down the mountainside, tree by tree. The wind already carried its small, serrated promise. And out on the far slope, 60 feet inside the rock, something patient and warm had been waiting for her. Perhaps all along. Grief, she understood now. Grief was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had a mountain to move, and not much time at all to learn how. She started the very next day. She did not know enough. She knew that much, but she had learned something in those first weeks of grief, that not knowing was a thing you could only cure by beginning. So she began. She went to the tunnel with a shovel and a lantern, and she measured out the dark with her own body, counting her crawling lengths from the mouth of the hole to the warm granite wall at the very back. 60 feet. Long enough for a small home, if she was careful with every inch of it. The last stretch against the warm stone would be the living chamber. The middle would be a passage, and the first stretch near the open mouth would be storage, and a windbreak against whatever came howling down the slope when the season turned. It was a simple plan, drawn in the dirt with the broken end of a stick, and it was enormous. She would need the floor cleared of fallen rubble. She would need it leveled, flat, and true. She would need stone to lay it. She would need clay and sand and straw and a kiln to fire the brick in. By her own rough count, she would need thousands of bricks for the great stone heater the old woman's journal described. Thousands. She had none of those things. She had a shovel, a pickaxe, and a pair of soft hands that had bled at the very first hour of honest work. So she started with the shovel. The first day, she shoveled rubble out of that tunnel until her arms would no longer rise. She slept that night like a stone dropped into deep water. And before the light came, she rose in the cold and the dark, and she did it again. The second day, the boy came out to watch her. He sat on a flat rock with his father's sketchbook open on his knees, and he drew her. A small woman, bent in the mouth of a mountain. The third day, he set the book down. He picked up a single stone, and he carried it with enormous care all the way to the spoil pile. She did not say anything. She did not want to make a thing of it. She just kept working. And when he came back for another, she was ready, and she steadied the wheelbarrow so the small stone would not roll back out. By the end of that week, he was carrying stones all morning. By the end of the next, his small hands were as raw as hers. She thought, more than once, about telling him to stop. She did not. He had lost his father. He had sat in the dark for a long time, with nothing in his hands but a dead man's sketchbook. He needed to carry something now. He needed to build something. So they built, together, the two of them, against the whole of the coming cold. The town began to notice. At first, they got it wrong. They thought she was shoring up the cabin, bracing the rotten foundation with stone, a hopeless thing, but a thing they could understand. The women in the dry goods store softened when her name came up. Poor thing, they said, just trying. A few more baskets came up the mountain, encouraging ones this time. A jar of pickles, a small ham wrapped in paper. And then she stopped working on the cabin entirely. And then she dug a shallow pit down by the creek and began mixing clay with sand and straw, treading it with her bare feet in the cold, like a woman making something older than the town itself. And then she built, with her own two hands, a small crooked kiln out of creekstone. And then the smoke began to rise from it, and the first bricks came out of it, misshapen, lumpy, ugly as sin, but hard, truly hard. She was not shoring up the cabin. She was building something else entirely, and that the town could not forgive. The whispers started when she went down for nails. Conversation stopped the moment she stepped through the door of the dry goods store. The shopkeeper's smile came too fast and pulled too tight at the corners. "Maren, dear, are you eating enough?" "I'm fine." "And the boy?" "The boy is fine. It's just, people have been saying..." "Saying what?" But the woman only shook her head and weighed out the nails and would not finish the sentence. Myron walked home with the nails heavy in her sack, and the unfinished sentence heavier still. She knew what they were saying. The widow had gone strange. The widow was digging a hole in the mountain. The widow meant to bury herself and her boy alive in it, and call it a home. And she understood something, climbing that frozen path. Pity did not turn to respect when you refused to break. It turned into something else, a quieter word, a colder one. Madness. The old woman came on the first truly cold morning of the season. Maren was down at the creek, hauling flat stones, her fingers gone numb in the icy shallows. The boy was up on the bank, sorting them by size, exactly the way his father had once sorted his samples of rock. She looked up, and there was someone standing on the path. An old woman, small, bird-boned, perhaps 70, perhaps far older. Her face was a map of deep weather, and her eyes were a startling pale blue, the color of ice with the sun behind it. She wore a man's heavy wool coat, much too large for her, and she leaned on a walking stick of black wood. Maren knew who she was. Everyone knew who she was. The old woman lived alone, in a cabin in the woods, out past the old church, and the town did not say much about her. What little it said was not kind. "Witch," they whispered. "Heathen. That strange foreign woman." Mothers steered their children to the far side of the road when she passed. Some of them made small signs with their fingers, against the evil eye. Now she stood on the path, both hands resting on her stick, and she looked at the flat stones, and at the boy, and at the crooked little kiln, smoking up the slope. "You are building a cachalofen," she said. Her voice was quiet. The accent was old and far away, and Marin could not place it. Yes, Marin said, and she got slowly to her feet, her back aching, her arms trembling with the cold. With clay alone, or with grog. Marin had no idea what grog was. She said so, plainly, and the old woman smiled. It changed her whole face. It seemed to take 40 years off it, all at once. Child, she said, I have waited a very long time for someone in this town to ask me about a cachalofen. She came down the path. She stopped a few feet away. Your husband came to me. He asked me a great many questions. I thought he meant to build one. A pause, and something moved behind the pale eyes. Then he was gone, and I thought the knowledge would die with me. She tilted her head and looked at the half-built kiln again. You are doing it wrong, she said, but you are doing it. And then, much softer, May I help? Marin's eyes filled. She had not wept in 2 months. She did not even know she still could. She nodded because her throat had closed too tight for any words at all. The old woman reached out one small, dry hand and laid it over Marin's wrist. Then we begin, she said. Her name was Greta. And she was, the town would swear to you, a witch. She was no witch. She was only an old woman who knew, better than any living soul in that whole valley, how to keep a house warm through a killing cold. Her dead husband had been a stonemason in the old country, a true master of these great stoves long before he ever crossed an ocean. And she had his drawings still, decades old, drawn in pencil on fine linen, the folds gone soft as cloth from years of careful handling. Each morning, before the light, she came up the path with those drawings rolled in a leather satchel, and her black stick in her hand. She would unroll the linen on a flat stone outside the tunnel. She would weight the corners with pebbles against the wind, and she would point. This is the throat, she would say. This is where the hot breath of the fire must turn. Lay the brick like so, and the fire breathes. Lay it wrong, and the fire chokes. Marin would nod and watch and remember. Her hands shook most mornings now, from cold, from the work, from the thin chicory broth that was all she could afford in the place of coffee. And if I lay them like this, she asked once, pointing. The old woman looked at her. Then you die, she said, pleasantly. Ah, Marin swallowed. Like so, then. Like so. Yes. But the old woman never once lifted a brick herself. She pointed. She corrected. She told long stories of the old country, while Marin's hands moved in the wet mortar. But it was always Marin's hands. Marin's back, bent in the cold tunnel. Marin's blisters that broke and bled and slowly hardened into something tougher than they had ever been. One morning, Marin held out a finished brick and asked her to set it. The old woman folded her hands on her stick and would not take it. It must be your hands, she said, not mine. A house is only warm if the right hands have built it. My hands built mine, long ago. Yours must build yours. I can show you where the stone goes, child. I cannot put it there for you. That part, no one can do for another. And so the widow built. The boy worked, too. He worked like a small, grim man. He carried small, grim stones. He sorted them by size and by color, frowning exactly the way his father once had. He wore his father's old leather work gloves, which came up past his elbows and made him look ridiculous. He looked beautiful. He did not speak much. But he was no longer silent. He had begun, somewhere in those weeks, to hum again, a small, tuneless humming while he worked. It came out of him steady and constant, like steam from a kettle on a low fire. Marin did not point it out. She did not say, "Look, you are humming again." She only listened, and she thought, "He is finding his way back to himself. We are finding our way back, both of us, together." The first stove failed. She knew it the moment the smoke came. It was a small one, a practice one. The old woman had insisted on it. "You do not build the true one first," she had said. "First, you build a wrong one. You learn what wrong feels like, in your hands, in your eyes, in your lungs. Then, you build right." So Marin built wrong. A short, ugly thing, set 10 feet inside the tunnel mouth. She fed it kindling, a handful of dry shavings. She struck the match. The fire caught, and for one beautiful breath, it climbed, golden and alive and singing. And then the smoke came, not up, not out, backward. A thick gray rope of it pouring out of the firebox, into the tunnel, into her eyes, into her son's small chest. The boy screamed. She had him in an instant. A wet rag thrown over his face. Out into the freezing air, the two of them on the path coughing, eyes streaming, lungs scraped raw and burning. "Mama, Mama, did we die?" "No, sweetheart, no. We're alive. We're alive." The old woman came up the path. She had heard the coughing all the way from the trees. She looked at the gray smoke still rolling out of the tunnel mouth. She did not laugh. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything at all for a long moment. She knelt slowly in front of the boy. She laid one hand on his small shoulder. "Brave boy," she said, "now you have met the smoke. The smoke is honest. The smoke always tells you what is wrong. Listen to it now, child." "What did the smoke say?" The boy wiped his eyes. He thought about it with his whole serious face. "It came backward," he said. "Yes, and why?" He thought harder. The hole was too small." The old woman smiled. "The hole was too small. Yes. The fire wanted more air than you gave it. The fire is greedy, always. Remember this." And then she turned to Marin. "Now, we tear it down, and we build it again." But Marin had already sat down hard on a cold rock and put her face in her raw hands. The old woman let her have it. She said nothing. She simply waited, leaning on her stick. "I almost killed him," Marin whispered. "No. The smoke. He was choking. I cannot do this, Greta. I cannot. Look at me." Marin looked up. The old woman's pale eyes were not soft. They were iron. Every builder of these stoves in all the old country built a wrong one first. My husband, his father before him. Every single one of them coughed black smoke. Every one of them sat down on a cold stone and put his face in his hands and said the very words you are saying now. "I cannot." She leaned closer, and then every one of them stood back up and tore down the wrong stove and built the right one. This is the work, child. There is no other way it has ever been done. Not once. Not by anyone. Marin breathed. She breathed. She wiped her face on a filthy sleeve. "All right," she said. "Yes, all right then. Up, up. We have light until evening, and not 1 minute to waste it grieving." Marin stood. The boy was watching her. She held out her raw hand to him. "Help me," she said. "Help me tear down the wrong one." He took her hand. He nodded, solemn, 6 years old, going on 100. And together, the two of them went back into the dark. She built it again, and this time, it drew. She watched the smoke crawl up through the brick, twisting, turning, slow and patient through the body of the little stove, surrendering its heat to the stone with every winding turn, exactly as the dead woman's journal had promised. And then she put her hand a foot from the brick, and she felt it. Heat. Not the angry roar of an iron stove, a clean, even, living warmth. The kind that came not from a fire at all, but from stone that had been carefully taught how to remember one. She turned away so the old woman would not see, and she wept, for the second time that day, but not the same kind of weeping. She had braced herself for the cold, for the wind, for the smoke and the long breaking labor of the stone. She had not braced herself for people. The bricks came first. She walked out one frozen morning to find half her brick pile crushed, smashed, stomped flat into the dirt. The green clay snapped and ruined where it had not yet finished curing. 2 weeks of work, gone in a single night. She stood in the cold and counted them, as if the counting could somehow undo it. The boy came and stood beside her. He took her hand. He was very, very still. Bad people, Mama. Yes, baby, bad people. Will they come back? She knelt down. She pulled him hard against her chest. If they do, my love, then we will be ready for them. But she did not feel ready. She felt a new kind of afraid, one she had never felt before. Not afraid of the cold, afraid of people, of the slow, quiet malice of men who did not even know her, who came in the dark, who chose to break a thing she had bled to build, rather than build a single thing of their own. That was a colder thing than any winter wind. She found him on the second night. She had not slept. She had wrapped herself in a blanket and sat at the edge of the kiln yard with her husband's old hunting rifle laid across her lap, unloaded. She had not had the heart to load it. She only wanted the shape of it in her hands, the weight of it. The moon was high and cold and very bright, and a figure came up the path, tall, carrying a long-handled sledgehammer. She rose to her feet. That's far enough. The figure froze. Drop the hammer. It dropped, heavy, into the snow. Step into the moonlight. Slow. He stepped, and it was a young man, 24 perhaps, built tall and broad through the shoulders, but quiet somehow, with sad gray eyes that did not belong to a vandal at all. It was the lumber baron's son. His name was Hollis, and he stood there in the silver light with his shoulders slumped and his big empty hands open at his sides. And his face was the face of a boy who has been caught doing a thing he hated every moment of doing. Your father sent you, Marin said. A long pause. Yes, ma'am. To smash my bricks. Yes, ma'am. The first time, too? Yes, ma'am. She sat back down, slowly, on the cold stone. She laid the rifle across her knees, and she looked at this big, sad young man in the moonlight, and she felt the very last thing on earth she had expected to feel. She felt sorry for him. Why did you come back tonight, Hollis? He did not answer. Hollis? To stop, ma'am. The words came out all in a rush, as if they had been waiting. To stop doing it. I meant to leave the hammer in your woodpile, whole, untouched, so you'd find it in the morning, and you'd know. so you'd know that somebody he could not finish. That somebody was on your side, Marin said softly. The wind moved through the bare aspens. Somewhere far down the valley, a coyote called once, and then the night went still again, and the widow felt something break deep inside her chest. Not the old stone of pity. That one had crumbled to dust weeks ago. A different stone, one she had not even known was there. The stone of believing herself utterly, completely alone in the whole wide world. It cracked. A small, clean sound, somewhere down beneath her ribs. "Come here, Hollis." He came. She stood. She held the rifle out to him. He took it without thinking. The way a young man raised around guns takes a gun. "It isn't loaded," she said. "Oh." He looked down at it, helpless. "I never could shoot anyway, ma'am." She almost smiled. "Why is your father afraid of me, Hollis?" He thought about it for a long while, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very low. "Because if you live, ma'am, then everything he's ever known about how to build a house, his whole life of it, is wrong." Marin let out a long, slow breath. "Yes," she said. "I believe you have it exactly right." He shifted his weight from one boot to the other. He looked down at the snow. "Mrs. Hale, I've got a sack of nails. Good ones, from the mill. The cut kind. The kind you can't buy out here for love nor money." He swallowed hard. "I could leave them in your kiln yard tomorrow night." "Hollis, if your father catches you helping me, what will he do?" A long pause. "Throw me out, I expect." "And where would you go?" "Don't rightly know, ma'am." She looked at this big, lost boy standing in her kiln yard in the dead of night. "Bring the nails," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And Hollis, if he asks whether you smashed my bricks, you tell him yes. You tell him you smashed every last one of them. Tell him you broke my heart while you did it. Tell him I wept." She paused. "Make it good. Make him believe it." A slow, tired, grateful smile spread across the young man's face. "Yes, ma'am." He turned to go. "Hollis." He looked back over his shoulder. "Thank you." He nodded once, quick, like the word had embarrassed him, and then he walked off into the dark. Marin sat back down on the cold stone, the unloaded rifle across her knees, and she thought a long time about how grief makes a person so certain that they are alone in the world, and how grief is a liar. There was no help for the broken bricks. They simply had to be remade. 4 days of mixing clay, 4 days of firing, 4 days of work the cold had already stolen from her and could never give back. The old woman did not say they had fallen behind. She did not have to. Marin saw her in the gray afternoons, standing very still and looking up at the sky, reading something in the slant of the light that Marin could not yet read for herself. And then the boy got sick. It came on at supper, on the night of the first heavy snow. He pushed his food away. "Not hungry, baby." "Mama, I'm hot." She put her hand to his forehead, and she went very, very still. His skin was on fire beneath her palm. By the deep of the night, he was burning. He talked to people who were not in the room. He talked to his father. He cried out for a blanket he was already lying beneath. She stripped him down. She bathed his small chest with cold water from the bucket. She watched it rise and fall, too fast, too shallow, and a single thought beat inside her like a drum. "I have killed him. I have killed him with my pride. Crane was right after all. She put on her coat. She put on her boots. She wrapped the boy in 3 blankets and lifted him, and he weighed nothing at all, and he weighed everything in the whole world. The town lay miles down the mountain, through snow already past her knees, in a wind that had grown teeth. She stepped out onto the porch, and a voice behind her spoke her name. She turned. The old woman stood at the edge of the firelight. She had walked all the way up through the snow, her satchel on her shoulder, and her face in the lamplight was old and hard and absolutely certain. "Where are you going, child?" "Town. The doctor. He's burning up, Greta. He's..." Her voice cracked clean in two. "He's dying." "He is not dying." "I have to. Listen to me. Listen." The old woman climbed the steps. She put both dry hands on Marin's shoulders. "If you walk into that town tonight with a sick child in your arms, they will not give you a doctor. They will give you a verdict. They will say you are an unfit mother. They will say the boy fell ill because of where you have chosen to make him sleep. And there are people down there who will see to it that he is taken out of your arms. You know this is true." Marin stood in the falling snow, holding her burning child against her chest. And she knew it was true. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her. "I have herbs," the old woman said, gentler now. "I have done this before, many times, with my own, with others. Bring him inside, child. Bring him into the warm. Greta, bring him in." She brought him in. The fever broke in the smallest, darkest hour, the one just before the dawn. The old woman had brewed something black and bitter, and they had gotten it into him 1 teaspoon at a time. They sponged him down. They sang to him, the old woman in her own old tongue, soft and strange, and Marin in plain English, 2 songs that did not match at all. And the boy drifted between them like a small boat between 2 distant shores. And then, near dawn, the fever let him go. His eyes opened, and they were clear. He looked up at his mother. "Mama," he said, "did we eat supper?" And Marin laughed. She laughed until she was weeping. She laughed into his hair and held him so tightly that the old woman finally had to reach out and gently pry her arms loose. "He needs to breathe, child," she said. Marin let go. She watched her son sink back down into sleep. A real sleep this time. The good kind. The healing kind. She turned to the old woman. She tried to say, "Thank you." She could not get the words past her throat. The old woman waved one hand in the air. "No," she said. "No thanks. Not for this." And something passed across her weathered old face then. Something deep and old and full of years. "This is a debt. One I have waited a very, very long time to pay." Marin did not understand. She would in time, but not yet. 3 nights later, the boy was well enough to sleep the whole night through. They had moved into the inner chamber by then. The great stove was finished, and it had been burning for a week, and the stone walls had begun to hold the heat just the way the old woman had promised they would. It was not yet truly comfortable. The brick had not fully charged, as Greta put it, the way a thing must be filled slowly before it can give back. But it was warm, far warmer than the cabin had ever been, even on its best night. The boy slept on a straw mattress against the warm wall, his cheek gone pink, his breath slow and deep and even. And Marin sat alone by the lamp, and she opened the last journal once again. She had read the front of it, the dry geological notes. She had never once turned all the way through to the back. The back had seemed blank that first night by the lamp. It was not blank. Tucked between the very last 2 pages was a folded sheet of paper, sealed with a single drop of red wax, gone cracked and brittle with the passing of time. Her name was written on the front of it, in his hand. She held it a long, long time before she broke the seal. And then she read the words her husband had left for her, not knowing, when he wrote them, if she would ever have cause to read them at all. He had written that he'd had a feeling, that men in his line of work got feelings, and that most of them were nothing, but that sometimes a feeling turned out to be a true thing. He had written that there was a man he did not trust, out at the high cut, and that he was setting this down only in case the feeling proved itself out. And then he had written this: "If you are reading this, then I am gone. And I am sorry. I am so very sorry, my brave girl. I had 100 more things I wanted to say to you in this life. So I will say only the one that matters most." Open the chest. Find the 4th journal. There is a map inside it. That old hole at the back of our land is not a folly, whatever the men in town may say of it. It is a gift. The stone at the back of it is warm, and I do not yet understand why, but I believe I will, if I am given the time. Read my great-grandmother's journal. Her people knew how to live in the bones of a mountain. Mine did, and yours will. And then, the line she would carry with her for the rest of her days: "You are stronger than you know. When I am not there to tell you so, you will not believe it. So believe me now. Believe me here, on this paper. You are stronger than you know. You always have been. You think the strength is mine. It was never mine, my love. It was always, always yours. Invite the mountain into our home. Build the fire small. Build the stone large. And hold our boy close. I will see you in the warm rock." Maren sat with the letter open in her lap. The lamp guttered low. She did not move. She thought of him writing it, folding it, pressing the warm wax with his thumb, slipping it quietly into the back of a journal, and hoping, with all his heart, that she would never have any reason to find it. He had known something was coming, and he had not told her, and he had quietly, secretly, made ready for it. She thought she should be angry with him. She found that she was not. She found that, for the first time in all those long and bitter months, she was not angry, and she was not afraid, and she was not lost. She was known. He had known her, better than she had ever known her own self. He had reached across from the far side of death to write her a letter, and the letter said, "You are stronger than you know." She pressed the paper flat against her chest, and she wept, quietly, so as not to wake the sleeping boy. Outside the chamber, far above them, beyond 60 feet of solid living granite, the wind had begun to rise, and inside, the stone was warm. She rose, and she stoked the great stove one last time before she let herself sleep that night. She fed it 3 pieces of seasoned wood, and watched the small hot fire take hold. She watched the smoke begin its long, slow, secret journey through the body of the stone, through all of its winding turns, giving up its warmth to the brick, exactly the way the old woman had taught her, hand over hand, day after freezing day. She laid her open palm flat against the stone. It was warm. It was patient. It had been waiting 1,000 quiet years in the dark. It could wait a little longer, and she thought, as she settled into sleep, of all the voices that had brought her here. A husband, gone half a year. A great-grandmother, gone a century. An old woman down the dark slope with a debt she would not yet explain. And a boy of 6, sleeping warm against the living rock. The first untroubled sleep he had slept since the day they laid his father down in the cold spring ground. She did not know it yet, but far up the valley, the sky had already begun to change. The wind had taken on a new and terrible kind of patience, and the old woman, climbing her own small hill at dawn to read the light, was going pale, and not yet finding the words for the thing she saw coming. The widow they had pitied was no longer afraid. She had read her husband's last words to her. She had built a hearth that told the cold stone a long, slow story, and the stone had learned to keep it. She had a roof of mountain over her child's head, and she had, in all the wide and frozen world, 3 people who had quietly chosen to stand at her side. She was ready, or as ready as any soul can ever be, for the thing that has not yet come. The bruised sky came on a quiet afternoon, 8 days later. The widow was outside, splitting one last barrel of kindling, when she straightened up and put a hand to her aching back and looked to the north. And the breath went out of her. The sky over the high peaks was not blue. It was not gray. It was not the white of an honest snow. It was the color of a bruise 3 days old, yellow at the edges, purple, sick and deep in the heart of it. And then the wind dropped, all at once, like a door pulled shut. A jay that had been screeching in the bare aspens behind her went silent in the middle of its own cry. The widow stood very still in that sudden, enormous quiet, and she felt something then, a cold, small touch on the back of her neck, light as a hand. She turned. There was no one there. There was only the bruised sky, and the silence, and a smell on the air she had no name for. The smell of something very old. The smell of something coming. She dropped the axe where she stood, and she walked, fast, toward the mouth of the mountain. She gathered the last few things from the dead cabin, a box of matches, the rifle, a small tin of black tea, and then she went into the tunnel, and she pulled the heavy oak door shut behind her. The door the young man had hung for her with his own 2 hands just the week before. She set the wedge at the bottom of it, and she walked the 60 feet inward into the warm. The boy was awake, sitting up on his straw mattress, his hair rumpled, his dark eyes very wide. "Mama." "Yes, baby." The wind stopped. "Yes." "Is it coming?" She knelt down beside him. She smoothed the hair back from his forehead, and she looked into his small, serious face, and she made herself a promise. She would not lie to him. "Yes," she said. "It is coming. Tonight, maybe, or in the morning. A big storm. A bigger one than anyone living has ever seen." He took that in. He nodded, slow. "Are we safe, Mama?" And she thought about it. She did not answer too quickly. The truth, when it came, was simpler than she had braced herself for. "Yes," she said. "We're safe. The mountain is going to keep us. Mama promises." "And other people?" She looked at him, 6 years old. "And other people," she said. "If they come, We will keep them too." He thought about this for a moment. "Like a bear," he said. She felt her throat tighten. "Like a bear." He nodded and lay back down and closed his eyes. And the widow rose and crossed the warm stone floor and laid one more piece of seasoned wood in the firebox of the great stone hearth. She watched the small fire take. She watched the smoke begin its long, patient journey through the body of the stove, through all its winding turns, up into the heart of the mountain, and out somewhere far above them, where the wind was about to begin to scream. She laid her hand flat against the warm stone, and she did not need the words this time. They had stopped being words at all. Somewhere in these last hard weeks, they had become something in her hands, in her spine, in the steady, certain way she breathed. She was a widow. She was 27 years old. She was a mother and a builder, and the keeper of a fire that did not roar, but remembered. And she was ready. Far above them, very high up, the first flakes began to fall. When the storm broke loose in earnest, it did not come down. It came sideways. By the deep of that first night, the wind had risen from nothing at all to a single, endless scream. Not the moan a wind makes through trees. A scream, the sound of a thing that has made up its mind to take everything that is not nailed down, and a good deal that is. The snow was not snow. It was hard, flying grit, small pellets that did not drift but flew, and struck the side of the dead cabin like a fistful of thrown gravel. That cabin would not see the morning? The widow knew it, and she did not care. She was 60 feet inside the mountain. The wind hunted for her. It came around the shoulder of the slope and tore at the heavy oak door. It got a corner of itself under the wood and pulled and pulled and pulled. The door held. The young man had hung it well. And the widow stood at the inner end of her warm, dark home and listened to the storm as a thing far away. A low vibration in the rock. The sound of a wolf you cannot see. She had fed the great stove at dusk, one small, hot fire. And then she had let it go out because she did not need it. The body of the stove was warm. The walls were warm. The floor was warm beneath her stocking feet. The chamber would hold its gentle heat all through the night without another single stick of wood. This was the thing the old woman had known. This was the thing the dead woman in the journal had known. You did not feed this hearth the way you fed an iron stove, hour after frightened hour. You fed it once. And then you let the stone pay you back, slow and steady, for a day and a night. The boy slept. His cheek was pink. His breath was deep. His small hand was half curled around the corner of his blanket. And the widow looked at him a long while in the soft lamplight. And she thought, he is the warmest he has ever been in all his short life. And he has no idea. Good. That is the point. That is exactly the point. She took off her boots. She lay down on her own mattress. She listened to the mountain hum around her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the widow slept, deep and whole and unafraid. Far down the mountain, in the town, the storm was doing its work. It found the grandest house first. It was the finest house in the whole valley. 2 full stories, glass in every window, a great black iron stove in the parlor, freighted up from the city at enormous cost, and a second one in the kitchen besides. It was the house a man builds when he wants the whole world to see, at a single glance, exactly what he has made of himself. And the lumber baron stood in his fine parlor, in the dead of that first night, and held his palms out toward the iron stove, and could not understand what was happening. The iron was so hot, it would have raised a blister on his hand. He could see the heat shimmering off the face of it. And yet, the room was cold. His wife sat on the settee beneath 3 coats. His 2 small daughters lay on the floor before the stove, wrapped in every blanket in the house, and their cheeks were too red, and their breathing was too fast. The windows were sheets of solid ice, frozen thick on the inside of the glass. His wife had stopped speaking an hour before. She was only watching him now, the way a woman watches a man who has made a decision that has put her children in danger. She was not yet angry. She was about to be. "Harlan," she said. "Yes?" "The girls are too cold. Look at their lips. Look." "I know it, Winifred. I am feeding the stove." "The stove is not enough. It is the finest stove in this valley." "Then the finest stove in this valley is not enough." He looked at her. She looked at him, and a moment passed between them. The kind of moment in a long marriage that you do not ever come all the way back from. They both felt it pass, and neither of them tried to stop it. He turned back to the fire. He fed it the last of the dry oak, and in some dark, locked-away corner of his mind, a thought tried to rise. He did not let himself look at it. He pushed it back down. It came up again anyway. By the gray of dawn, the dry oak was gone. He started on the green pine then. Green pine is what a man burns when he has nothing left, and is desperate enough to fill his fine house with wet smoke and bitter creosote to do it. The fire hissed, the fire spat, the fire smoked. The room grew thick with it. The room did not grow warm. And by mid-morning, his younger daughter had begun to shiver in a way the man did not like at all. He told himself the shivering was good. The shivering meant her small body was still fighting, still trying. And then the shivering stopped. The little girl lay very still beneath her blanket. The man stared at her. His wife stared at him. "Harlan," her voice was very quiet now. It had the shape of a blade in it. She was right, wasn't she? He did not answer. He could not. "The widow," his wife went on, every word falling like a stone. "The widow we pitied. The widow you climbed that mountain to frighten out of her own home. She was right, and we are wrong. And if this does not break, we will be dead by morning. Won't we, Harlan?" He could not answer her, because the answer was yes. The storm gave them one small window near midday. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan. The flying grit thinned to a steady falling snow. It would not last. He knew it would not last. He put on his heaviest coat. "There is no help out there," his wife said. "The whole town is the same as us." "I'm not going for help," she turned. "Then where?" "I'm going up the mountain." "Why?" He looked at her. And he found in that moment that he could no longer lie to her. Not after all these years. Not now. "Because if she's alive up there, I have to know it." "Why?" "Because I sent her there." A long silence stretched between them, and then his wife crossed the cold room and put both her hands on his face. Her hands were like ice. "Bring her down," she said. "If she lives, you bring her down. Bring her boy. Bring her witch. Bring whoever she has up there with her. I do not care anymore who was right and who was wrong. I care who is warm." He nodded. "And Harlan." Her eyes were terrible and clear. "If you find them dead up there, you do not come back to me. Do you understand? You do not walk back into this house and tell me you found that woman and her child frozen in the dark. You stay up there with them. You sit with them, and you do not come home." He stared at her. She meant every word of it, and he understood, in that frozen parlor, a thing he had somehow never understood in all their years together, that he did not truly know this woman, and that he was going to lose her, even if he lived, even if his daughters lived, unless he did this one thing now, and did it exactly right. He went out into the storm. The climb was the hardest hour of the man's life. 3 miles straight up through snow that came to his hips, and in the deep places to his chest. The wind found him again 20 minutes in. The window had closed. The storm had decided he was not getting back out of it. His face froze in patches. His lungs felt as though they had been filled with broken glass. He fell 3 times, and 3 times he got back up. Each time he thought about not getting up. Each time he thought, a man who would send a widow and her child to a hole in the ground and tell her not to come knocking when the cold came. That man has earned the right to lie down in the snow and not rise again. But he kept walking. He kept walking because his younger daughter had stopped shivering on the floor of his fine, warm house. He kept walking because his wife had told him not to come home without them. He kept walking because 40 long years of building good square houses with good iron stoves in them had not been enough, in the end, to keep his own children warm. And somewhere on that mountain, somewhere between the second fall and the third, something inside the man broke. Not his body. His body would mend. Something else. The thing in him that had once stood at the foot of a widow's porch steps and refused to come inside. The thing that had said sentiment is not shelter. The thing that had looked at a poor woman's labor and called it a pile of mud, a death trap, a madness. That thing died on the slope, and the man who kept climbing through the screaming dark was not anymore the man who had set out at dawn. He came over the last rise, and he saw the cabin. What was left of it, half collapsed, buried to the eaves on one side, the door gone under the drift, the crooked chimney leaning at a broken angle, no smoke, no light, no sign of any living thing. And the man went down to his knees in the snow. I am too late. The thought arrived whole and simple. They are in there, frozen in the dark, the woman and the boy. And it is my doing, all of it, mine. He bowed his head, and he wept. He had not wept since the death of his own father, long ago. The tears froze on his frozen face. He knelt there a long time. He did not know how long. He thought, perhaps, he would simply stay, close his eyes, let the cold take him too. He thought, in some quiet, broken place, that he had earned exactly that. And then he saw it. Through the haze of the blowing snow, past the dead cabin, out on the far slope. A shimmer, not smoke, a shimmer in the freezing air, the way the air shimmers over a hot road in the height of summer. A small, impossible distortion, a breathing in the heart of all that cold. And it was rising up out of the ground, out of the mouth of an old, forgotten prospect hole. The man stared at it, His mind would not take it in. It was impossible. It was a trick of his dying eyes. It was a vision sent to a freezing man in his final hour. He got to his feet. He walked toward it. He fell. He got up. And he kept walking. The brush at the mouth of the tunnel had been cleared away. He could see beneath the fresh snow where a path had been worn, where someone had gone in and come out, in and out, day after day after day. He reached the dark mouth of it, and he felt it. A breath. A slow, warm, impossible exhalation coming up out of the black hole in the rock. He fell to his knees one last time, and he pulled himself in. 10 feet, and the wind was gone. 20 feet, and his frozen face began to thaw, and the thawing was a deep and burning pain, and he welcomed it because pain meant he was still alive. 30 feet, the air was no longer cold. 40, 50, and there was light ahead. Not firelight. A soft, steady, golden glow. Lamplight. He came around a slight bend in the tunnel, and he stopped. He stopped on his hands and knees in the dark, and he stopped because what lay before him made no sense at all. A room. A small, warm chamber carved from the living rock. The walls rough granite. The floor laid in flat, fitted stone. And against the far wall, a great squat beast of a stove, dark and silent, throwing off a heat he could feel from clear across the room. A small wooden table, 2 chairs, 2 straw mattresses against the warm wall, a line strung from one wall to the other, with 2 small shirts and a pair of stockings hung up to dry, and the whole place smelled of bread and of a stew, bubbling slow in an iron pot set into the side of the great stove. And at the table, in a clean dress, sat the widow. She was mending a small tear in her son's shirt, and the boy lay on his stomach on the warm stone floor, drawing on a slate with a nub of charcoal, his feet bare. The bottoms of his small bare feet were pink from the warmth of the stone, in the very heart of the worst storm in living memory. The man could not move. He stayed there on his hands and knees in the entrance, his mouth open, and no sound would come out of him at all. The boy looked up. He saw the man. He did not scream. He did not even seem surprised. He only said in his calm, small voice, "Mama, there's a man." The widow turned. She set down her sewing, and she looked at the lumber baron on his hands and knees in the doorway of her home, frozen and weeping and broken. And she did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything at all for a long moment. Then she rose, and she crossed the warm stone floor in her stocking feet, and she knelt down in front of the man who had once told her not to make him carry her body out of the snow. She looked at his frozen, weeping face, and she said, "Mr. Crane." He could not answer. She laid one hand on his shoulder. "You're cold," she said gently. "Come in." He could not speak for the better part of an hour. She did not push him. She helped him out of his frozen coat. She pulled off his boots. She rubbed his great cold hands between her own small warm ones. She wrapped a wool blanket around his shoulders. She sat him at her table and set a bowl of stew before him, and his hands shook so badly that she had to feed him the first 3 spoonfuls herself. The boy watched all of it from the floor, calm and curious, and said nothing, and went on with his drawing. And at one point, the man saw what the boy was drawing. It was the chamber, the stove, the 2 chairs, the line of laundry on the wall. The boy was drawing his home, And the lumber baron put his face in his hands. When at last he could speak, he said only one word. How? The widow set down her own spoon. How what, Mr. Crane? How is any of this possible? And she thought about it. She did not gloat. She did not lecture him. She only said, quietly, Your stove shouts, Mr. Crane. A pause. My hearth tells a story. He stared at her. I don't understand. I know you don't, so I'll tell you. And she told him. She told him how an iron stove burns its wood fast and makes the iron hot, and the hot iron makes the air hot, and the hot air rises and leaks away out of every crack at the top of a house, and the cold rushes in low to take its place. So the man burns more wood, and the iron gets hotter, and more warm air escapes, and more cold comes in to replace it. You are heating the whole valley, Mr. Crane, she said, with one stove, and losing. He stared at her. My hearth is a different thing, she said. It burns one small fire once, and the smoke does not flee up the chimney. It is made to wander through the body of the stone, through all its long, slow turns. And as it wanders, it pays for its passage. It leaves every last bit of its heat behind, in the brick. And the brick holds it. And the brick warms the floor. And the floor warms my son's bare feet. And the walls. And the bowl that is in your two hands right now. She paused. And all around this little room is a mountain. And the mountain does not let the cold in. The mountain has been warm 1,000 years. The mountain will be warm 1,000 more. She looked at him, steady and clear. I did not fight the cold, Mr. Crane. I went underneath it. The man sat with the warm bowl in his shaking hands. He had built houses for 40 years, and he had been wrong for 40 years. It was too large a thing to fit inside a man's chest all at once. He set the bowl down. He bent forward over the little table, and he wept again for a long time. The boy watched him quietly, and the widow reached across the table and laid her hand on the back of the man's bowed head, very gently, the way you would touch a frightened child. She did not speak. She only let him weep. And when at last he could speak again, he said, My wife, my daughters, they're dying down there. The little ones stopped shivering. My house is colder than a grave. I came up here to know if I'd killed you. I didn't come up here to ask you for... You didn't ask, the widow said. She had already risen. She was already crossing to the line on the wall, taking down a thick wool shirt that had once belonged to her husband. Put this on, under your coat. She handed him a pair of dry wool socks. And these. Mrs. Hale, I can't ask you to. You didn't ask, Mr. Crane. She knelt and began to lace up her own boots. Asa. The boy looked up. We're going down the mountain to bring back Mr. Crane's family, and maybe others. You stay here by the warm stove. You do not open this door for anyone but Mama. Say it back to me. Stay by the stove, the boy recited, solemn. Don't open the door for anyone but Mama. Good boy. She turned. The man was staring at her. Why? He said. She buttoned her coat to the throat, and she looked at him. Because your wife is not guilty, she said. Because your little girls are not guilty. And because if I sit here in the warm and let those children freeze in the dark to make a point about who was right, Then I become a thing I am not willing to become. She picked up the lantern. I am going to be the kind of person who opens the door, Mr. Crane. Now come. There's no time. And she went out into the screaming dark. And after one frozen breath, the man rose and laced his boots and followed her. The way down was easier than the climb, for it ran downhill. And it was harder than the climb, because this time the man was walking back into the very thing he feared. She did not stop at his house first. On the way down, she turned off the road and waded through the drifts to the door of the parsonage and pounded on it with the side of her fist. The Reverend opened it. Behind him, in a parlor where every breath hung visible in the air, sat the small old woman who was his wife, wrapped in 3 quilts, her lips gone the color of the sky before the storm. The old woman saw the widow, and the widow saw her. "Get up," the widow said. "Now, child, we're all right." "You are not all right. Get up. Get your coat." The Reverend stared at her. "Mrs. Hale, we couldn't possibly impose—" "Reverend, there is no such thing as imposing tonight. There is alive, and there is dead. Get your wife, get your coat, walk." He looked at her. He looked at his wife, and his wife was looking up at him with eyes that said, plainly, "Please." He got his coat. They gathered more along the way. The school teacher and her cousin. 2 small children whose father had not come home and whose mother was sick. The blacksmith's wife, heavy with child, whose husband had gone out hours before for a doctor and not returned. Each one was easier than the last. And the lumber baron carried his own younger daughter up that mountain with his own 2 arms, and the widow carried the older girl, and behind them came a small, grim, stumbling line of people through the snow. By the time they reached the mouth of the mountain, there were 11 of them. She got them all inside. She moved the boy's mattress. She moved the table. She unrolled every blanket she owned, and she laid the 2 small girls down on the warm stone floor, right in front of the great hearth, with the goose-down quilt the old Reverend's wife had once given her spread over the both of them. Within a quarter of an hour, the younger girl's color began to come back, and the lumber baron's wife knelt there on the warm stone and watched the life return to her daughter's small face, and she pressed her own face into her husband's coat, and she wept without making a single sound. The storm raged on for 2 more days. It buried the town to the rooftops. It tore the roof clean off one building and flattened more than one barn. It killed cattle in the low fields, and it stripped the mountain bare. And in all that time, it did not take a single human soul, because by the time the great storm had finally screamed itself out, there were nearly 30 people gathered inside the widow's mountain. She had gone back down twice more, once for the doctor's family, once for an old man whose shack was leaning under the snow load. The 3rd time she made to go, the lumber baron stood himself in front of the heavy oak door and would not move. "You'll go off the edge of the path in this," he said. "The wind's changed. There's ice under the new snow you can't see. Your boy needs his mother." He drew himself up. "Let me go. You sent me up this mountain in the cold to die, Mrs. Hale, and I didn't die. And then you came down and carried my children out of the dark with your own arms." His voice broke. "Let me go down and carry someone else's. Let me make this one small thing right." She looked at him a long moment, and then she stepped aside. He came back hours later, half frozen, carrying a young man with a broken leg. The young man's mother had not lived. The Baron had sat with her a while at the end, he said quietly, and told her she had been a good mother. He did not know if she had heard him. The widow put a hand on his arm, and she said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. On the second night, when most of the rescued had finally fallen asleep on the warm stone floor, the lumber baron's wife came and sat across the little table from the widow, who was kneading the next morning's bread. She watched the widow's hands work the dough for a while, and then she said, very low, "I let him call you a fool. In our own parlor, I sat there and listened to my husband tell the men of this town that you were unfit and not in your right mind. And I knew the whole time that you were neither, and I said nothing. For all these months, I said nothing." The widow's hands went still in the dough. "I am sorry," the baron's wife said. "I am so sorry." And the widow looked at her a long time. She thought, "She is asking me to forgive her tonight." She thought, "I do not know if I can forgive her tonight." And she thought, "But she did not knock on my door all those long months. She did not bring me a single basket of dry bread or a quilt or a kind word. And yet, here she is, warm, on my floor, asking." And the widow wiped her hands on her apron, and she came around the little table, and she sat down beside the baron's wife. "I won't tell you tonight that I forgive you," she said, "because I don't yet know if I do. And I would not lie to you, not in this room." The other woman bowed her head. "But I will tell you this," the widow went on. "You are warm tonight. Your daughters are warm tonight. You are eating my bread and sleeping on my floor. And I did not bring you up here because you deserved it." She looked into the fire. "I do not save people because they have earned it. I save them because they are alive. That is all. That is the whole of it." A silence. "That is enough," the baron's wife whispered. "That is more than enough." And she reached over in the warm dark and took the widow's roughened hand in her own. And the widow let her. The two of them sat that way for a long while on the bench by the great stone hearth, while all around them, in the belly of a mountain, nearly 30 souls slept warm and safe and breathing. Outside, the wind went on screaming, and inside, the stone remembered every story it had been told. The storm broke on the third morning. The widow woke before the others, in the gray hush before dawn. She rose from her mattress, stepped carefully over the sleeping shapes of nearly 30 souls, and put her shoulder to the heavy oak door. It would not move. She pushed harder. A crack of pale light appeared. She forced it open through 6 feet of fresh drift, until at last she could climb up and out onto the snowbank, into the new and silent world. The cold hit her face, but it was only cold now, the ordinary kind, the kind a person remembers and survives. The killing cold was gone. She stood knee-deep in fresh snow, and her breath rose up in slow clouds, and she looked out at a valley made entirely new. The aspens were buried to half their height. The dead cabin was gone, only a low white mound where it had stood. And the sun was just coming up over the high peaks, and the light struck the snow, and the whole world turned for one held breath, pink and then gold, and then a clean and blinding white. She thought of her husband and the words he had left her, sealed in red wax. I will see you in the warm rock. She had seen him every single day for 2 long months. And the widow stood there, alone in all that brightness, and she began, very quietly, to laugh. She laughed, and the laughing turned to weeping, and the weeping turned back again to laughing, and she stood in the snow, making a sound that was neither one thing nor the other, but only the sound a heart makes when it has been carrying too much for too long, and is finally allowed to set it down. But this is not where her story ends. A great many storytellers would end it here, with the storm broken, and the children warm, and the proud man humbled in the snow, and it would be a fine place to stop. But the truest part of this tale was only just beginning, because surviving a hard winter is one thing. What a person builds in all the long, quiet seasons after, that is another thing entirely. That first morning, the lumber baron came up out of the tunnel behind her, blinking in the new light. He wore her dead husband's wool shirt beneath his coat. His face was scabbed and raw from the cold. His gray hair had gone grayer in 3 days. He stood beside her in the snow and looked at the morning the way a man looks at a thing he never truly expected to see again. We're alive, he said. Yes, you did this. And the widow shook her head slowly. No, she said, my husband did this. The old woman did this. A woman who has been dead longer than this town has stood. She did this. I only listened, Mr. Crane. That was my part. I did the listening. He was quiet a long while, and then he said in a low voice, Will you teach us? Teach you what? All of it. The stone, the fire, the hill, the listening. He turned to her. Will you teach us how? She thought about it. In the spring, she said at last, I will teach anyone who wants to learn. I'll be the first to come. I know you will, Jacob. She had never once used his given name before, but you won't be the only one. He nodded, and the two of them stood in the snow, the widow and the broken, proud man, and watched the sun climb over a world wiped clean. Then she reached down and scooped up a handful of new snow and put it in her mouth. It tasted like the morning. It tasted like a world starting over. She turned and climbed back down into the warm. There were nearly 30 people down there, after all, and they were all going to want their breakfast, now, to understand what the old woman did next, and why. A person has to understand a thing the widow herself did not yet know. She found it out 2 nights later, when the worst was past, and the rescued families had begun, one by one, to make their slow way back down to dig out their buried homes. The old woman had survived the storm. Of course she had. She had a small stone hearth of her own, built long ago by her own 2 hands, and it had kept its quiet heat through every winter for longer than most folks in that valley had been alive. And on that second evening, the widow walked the 2 miles through fresh snow to the old woman's cabin to thank her properly, to ask her something that had been sitting in her chest for days. She knocked. Come. The old woman was at her table, cutting onions. Her cabin was small and tidy, and smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. A small stone stove, a fraction the size of the widow's, stood against one wall, breathing out its gentle warmth. The widow stood in the doorway, and she did not know quite how to begin. Greta, she said, the night my boy was sick, you told me, You said this was a debt, one you had waited a very long time to pay. The old woman did not look up. She kept cutting her onions. Yes, she said. I said that. Tell me. A long silence, and then the old woman set down her knife. She wiped her hands on her apron, and she gestured to the chair across the little table. Sit, child. The widow sat. The old woman poured out 2 cups of dark, bitter chicory and pushed one across the table. She looked down at her own old hands for a while, and when she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet and very far away. My husband was a stonemason, she said, in the old country, a master of these great stoves, before we ever crossed the water. We came here young, the 2 of us, with his drawings and his tools and our 2 small children. She paused. A girl and a boy. The girl was 6. The boy was 3. The widow went very still. My husband wished to build a cachalofin, the old woman said. Here, in this valley. He knew how. He had the drawings, but the town was new then, and full of men from the cities back east. Iron men. Catalog men. They laughed at him. They said his stove was a peasant thing. A pile of mud. They said no respectable man would keep such a thing in his parlor. She turned her cup slowly on the table. And my husband was young and proud, and he did not wish to be laughed at in the new place where he had brought his family. So he did not build his stove. He listened to them. He bought an iron stove from a catalog, and he built our cabin just like all the others. The widow's breath had gone shallow. That first winter was a hard one, the old woman said. Not the hardest the valley has ever seen, but hard enough. And the iron stove ate its wood and gave back nothing, and by every morning the room was cold, and the fire was dead, and the iron sat there in the dark, black and useless as a stone. She did not look up. My daughter took ill in the deep of it, a sickness of the lungs. The cabin could not hold its heat. We could not keep her warm enough, and she... The old woman stopped. She did not see the spring. The widow's hand had risen to her mouth. My son followed her 2 weeks after. The old voice did not rise, did not break. It had said these words to itself, alone, for too many years to break now. And my husband died the next spring. Of nothing. Of grief. He sat down in a chair one afternoon, and he did not get up again. The doctor said it was his heart. She finally lifted her pale blue eyes. It was not his heart. His heart had died that winter, in the cold, with his children. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The little fire ticked in the small stone stove. I built my own hearth that next winter, the old woman said. Alone, from his drawings. The stove he was too proud and too afraid to build while they still lived. I sat before it the first night it held its heat, and I wept, because it was warm, and my babies were not there to feel it. She wrapped her old hands around her cup. I have carried this for more years than you have been alive, child, and I never told a single living soul. There was no one to tell. She looked at the widow, and then your husband came up my path, a young man with his great-grandmother's journal in his hands, a man who could read the old tongue, who asked me about the stoves, who listened, the way my own husband used to listen, before pride took him. And I thought, perhaps the knowledge will not die with me after all. A pause. And then he died too. And I thought again, it will die with me. She reached across the table and took the widow's hand in both of her own. And then his widow began to dig a hole in the side of a mountain. Her grip tightened. Do you understand now, child? When you came down that path with clay on your bleeding hands, I was not helping a stranger. I was finishing a sentence I began a lifetime ago. I was laying my children down to rest at last, not in the cold this time. Her old eyes shone. In the warm. The widow was weeping now, quietly, nodding. So you see, the old woman said, it was never me helping you. It was the two of us, helping each other, helping them, the ones we could not save, saving someone else's child, at long last, through our hands. And she let go. And she picked the knife back up, and she went on cutting her onions, as if she had not just set down a burden she had carried for 100 years. Eat, she said. I am making a stew, and then we will go back to your tunnel. The throat of the chimney wants another course of brick. You laid it crooked yesterday, and I am too old to climb that hill twice in one day. The widow laughed through her tears. Yes, ma'am. Drink the chicory first. It is good for sorrow. Yes, ma'am. And she drank. It was good for sorrow. The spring came late that year, but it came. And when it did, the old woman walked down into the town that had whispered the word witch behind her back for the better part of a lifetime. She walked into it with her stick in her hand and her dead husband's drawings in her satchel. And she walked into it like a woman coming home. The lumber baron met her at the edge of the town. He took off his hat. He bowed his gray head. Ma'am, he said, I owe you an apology, and I don't rightly know how to make one big enough. The old woman looked at him a long, long moment, and then she said, Build the stoves, Mr. Crane. Build the stoves I begged my husband to build when this town was young. Build them in every house in this valley. That is how you make it. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. I'll start with the parsonage. Good. She began to walk past him, and then she stopped. And Mr. Crane, you may tell the women in the dry goods store that I am not a witch. You may tell them I am only an old woman who happened to know how to keep her own house warm, and that I will be taking students. Yes, ma'am. And she walked on into the heart of the town that had feared her, her chin high, her stick tapping the thawing ground. The man kept his word. He started with the parsonage, just as she had told him to, and then the schoolhouse, and then, one cold hearth at a time, the houses of the valley. You could see it if you stood on the high ground at dusk, where once the chimneys had all roared their gray smoke straight up into the dark, fighting the cold and losing. Now the smoke came up thin and slow and barely warm. A whole valley, at last, had stopped shouting at the winter and learned instead to tell it a story. He built them to the old woman's drawings. He built them with his son at his side, the tall, quiet young man who had once carried a sledgehammer up a moonlit path, and who turned out, in the end, to be a far finer mason than he had ever been a saboteur. The Baron built one in his own grand house, and then he tore the great black iron stove out of his parlor, and he gave it away, free, to a man passing through to a gentler country, and told him to take the thing somewhere it might do a little good. But here is the part the storytellers forget. The widow did not become a great woman of the town. She did not run for any council. She was not made the head of anything. No building was ever given her name. She raised her son. That was all. She lived quietly in her home inside the mountain, and she added to it year by year. A second chamber for sleeping, a small room where she copied out the old journals by hand in clean, plain English, and gave a copy to any soul who came and asked for one. And the women of the town began to come. Not at first. At first they were ashamed. They had carried baskets of dry bread up that mountain once. They had whispered. They had let their husbands speak for them, and they had said nothing for a long time. But shame, like grief, has its season, and it passes. And by, the women of the valley began to walk up the path to the widow's mountain, one at a time, two at a time, with quiet questions in their mouths. And the questions were not always about the stoves. The shopkeeper came one day with a question about her marriage. The blacksmith's wife came with a worry about her son. The lumber baron's wife came more than once with a question about her own heart. And the widow would sit them down at her little table. She would pour the dark chicory, and she would listen. She would say very little, but she would listen, the way the mountain had taught her to listen, slow and patient, and without rushing in to fix the thing too soon. She would wait in the warm quiet until the woman across the table had finally said the thing she had truly climbed that mountain to say. That, in the end, was the gift the widow gave the valley. Not the warmth in the stone, the warmth in the listening. The seasons turned and turned and turned again. The boy grew. The quiet, serious child became a quiet, serious young man. He read his father's journals until the leather went soft in his hands. He read the dead woman's words from the old country. He read, more times than he could count, the letter his father had left his mother, sealed in red wax, that began, "You are stronger than you know." He went away to the city for a time to study the very stone his father had loved. And then he came home again, the way the truest sons do. And he worked the high cuts in the summers, with his mother at his side, the two of them reading the bones of the mountain together. In time, he married. A school teacher with a kind face and a patient voice. And on the morning of his wedding, his mother gave him the only piece of advice she would ever offer him about the keeping of a marriage. She took both his hands in hers. "Listen to her," she said. "Listen to her the way the mountain listens to the water. The water knows where it is going. The mountain need only have the patience to let it carve the way." He did not understand it that morning. He would understand it in pieces over all the long years that followed. The old woman did not live to see the boy married. She passed, in the fullness of her years, on a soft autumn evening, in her own small cabin, beside her own small stone hearth. The widow was with her at the end. She held the old hand that had once closed over her wrist on a frozen morning, and said, "Then we begin." "Are you warm?" the widow asked her near the end. And the old woman smiled. "I am warm," she said. "And so are they. At last, so are they." And she closed her pale blue eyes, and the little fire breathed its slow and patient breath. And the old woman went on, at long last, to wherever it is that the warm-hearted go. They buried her in the warm part of the season, beside two small graves that no one in the town had tended for the better part of a lifetime. The widow tended them now. She planted something at the head of each one, and every spring, for the rest of her own long life, she carried water up that hill, and she knelt at 3 graves instead of 2. And she told them, the old woman and her 2 lost children, what she had built that year, who had come up the mountain, what new soul had learned to keep a fire small and a stone large. She told them the valley was warm now, all of it, every house. She told them it had taken a lifetime, and another lifetime before that, but that it had come, that the thing the proud men had laughed at all those years ago had won in the end, not by shouting, by patience, by being warm, year after year, until the cold simply had no more arguments left to make. And the graves, of course, said nothing back. But the widow had long since learned that the quiet ones are not the same as the empty ones. She had learned that from a mountain. The widow lived to be very old, and in all those long years she never spoke much of the storm. When the children of the valley asked her about it, the great storm their grandmother still talked of in hushed voices, she would only smile and pour them a cup of something warm and turn the talk to other things. She did not think of herself as a hero. She never had. She had only been cold once and frightened and entirely alone, or so she had believed, and she had picked up a dead woman's journal and put her hand on a warm stone and made a single stubborn decision that she would not lie down. That was all. That was the whole of it. She had listened to a husband who had been gone half a year. She had listened to a great-grandmother who had been gone the better part of a century. She had listened to an old woman the whole town had called a witch. She had listened to a child of 6 who had said all right when she told him they were going to go and live inside a mountain. And she had listened to the mountain, and the mountain had answered her. It always does, in the end. That was the thing she came to believe in her great old age, sitting by her warm stone hearth with the valley spread out white and quiet below her. The mountain is always speaking. The warm stone, the slow earth, the patient dark. It is always telling its long, slow story to anyone who has the stillness to hear it. The only question is whether a person can become quiet enough, and brave enough, and broken open enough to finally listen. So, if on some cold evening you should find yourself sitting in a warm and quiet room with a cup of something hot between your hands, and the wind perhaps pressing soft against the glass, think for a moment of the widow they once pitied. Think of a young woman with a fatherless boy in a falling down cabin, in a town that had already finished telling her story for her. A woman who opened a chest she had been too afraid to open, who read words she had been too afraid to read, who put her bleeding hand against a warm stone in the dark and decided she would live. And then think, just for a moment, of the iron stoves in your own life. The loud things, the certain things, the things you have been told by confident voices are simply the only way a thing can be done. And ask yourself, in the warm and honest quiet, what tunnel of yours has been waiting all this time at the back of the property? What journal sits unopened in the chest at the foot of your bed? What stone, somewhere in the one wild and only life that is yours, has been warm all along, just under your hand, waiting only for you to be still enough to feel it? Build the fire small, build the stone large, Hold close the people that you love and listen. Always, always listen to the story.